Hello and welcome back to Hot Topics, the DuraSpace community webinar series. My name is Kristi Searle and I will be facilitating today's session. Just a reminder that the chat window is available at the left side of your screen. At the end of the presentation today, we will be taking questions from our audience and we'll ask you to post your questions in the chat window at that time. We are pleased to have you with us today as we conclude our 11th Hot Topics series, Integrating ORCID Persistent Identifiers with DSpace, Fedora, and VIVO. The curator of this series, Josh Brown, will get us started with today's presentation, Enhancing Early Career Researcher Profiles, VIVO and ORCID Integration. Thank you for being with us today. I will turn it over to Josh.
Thanks, Kristi, and thanks everybody for joining us today. It's been a real privilege to curate this series for DuraSpace, and this is our third and final webinar in the series. Recordings of the previous two are available on the DuraSpace site. Now, today we have three great speakers. We have Kristi Holmes from Northwestern University. We have John Corson-Rikert and Simeon Warner, both from Cornell University. I'm going to start us off today just by talking a little bit about the background, the work that really led to the information we'll be sharing with you today being created. It's been an interesting story working with VIVO, and we've worked well with them for several years now, so it's great to have this chance to showcase some of what we've been doing. So, let me start just by talking a little bit about what ORCID is. I'm sure many of you do know, but for those of you who don't, ORCID, which stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier, is a community-driven, not-for-profit organization that issues unique identifier numbers, much like a social security number or a credit card number or a driving license, to anybody who's active in the research scene. Now, the question you may ask is why. So that's what I'll start by talking about. Our colleagues at the Australian National Data Service did an analysis of the names of authors in a major journal citations database. And as you can see from this highlighted section of text in the middle, more than 2/3 of them were not unique. So this name ambiguity problem is colossal. If you think about 6 million authors, more than 4 million of those shared a name, and that name could refer to 7 other people. That's makes it very, very difficult to identify people definitively in the growing world of scholarly communications. Now, another great use case that demonstrates the value of having this unique identifier as well as your name is that people's names change. Sometimes they're married. Sometimes they use professor or doctor as their career changes. Sometimes journals choose a different model. So in some journals I might be Josh Brown, in others I'm Joshua Brown, in some I'm Josh A. Brown, in some I'm J. A. Brown, and it's all me, but how does anybody know that looking in from the outside? So, ORCID is a hub. We have a central registry of all our identifiers linked to information about those researchers. APIs connect researchers, their works, the organizations where they've been educated or where they have worked, and other identifiers. You can imagine ISBNs for books, DOIs for journal articles, and so on and so forth. We link to publishers. We link to repository systems. We link to profile systems like VIVO. We link to funders, grant management, and application systems. We link to a whole range of information resources, and we provide a way of moving information between all of those. Since the registry was launched in 2012, we've got 195 members. We're slightly over now, just pushing 200. We've issued close to 1.3 million identifiers to researchers, and we're witnessing really rapid growth. The level of adoption is enormous, as you can see from this graph. The way that it breaks down across the world is that we have 20% of our members come from the repository community, 45% come from research institutes, 16% from publishing. So we really are embedded in every aspect of the research ecosystem. This graph just breaks down our adoption rates globally. The majority of our members and adopters are in the Americas, and we have a good chunk in the European, Middle East, and Africa. And the Asia Pacific is actually our fastest growing region now. The background to the work that I'm going to present and we're going to talk about today starts in 2013 when ORCID was awarded a grant for an adoption and integration program by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. As it says on the slide here, it was designed to increase ORCID adoption and integration in universities specifically. And if you click this link at the bottom of the slide, you'll find our final report, which describes all the work that was done. I think we ended up with ORCID integrations in more than 13 different software systems or platforms, worked with universities, scholarly societies, a whole range of fantastic work came out of that. And part of this was this VIVO work you'll be hearing about today. Now, these charts are possibly a little dense for you to read on your screen, but what I think they illustrate very clearly is that this approach to boosting uptake in universities and research institutes has really paid off. The graph on the left shows new members in each year, new integrations, and you can see that we went from a fairly small proportion of them being in universities. This is the blue bar you can see there in 2012, to the majority, a huge majority, close to 70%, were from the university sector in 2014. And the rate of growth you can see in the graph on the right there tells that story very vividly. We're accelerating in universities, more researchers are becoming involved. And this is the point where ORCID, I think, is emerging as just part of good practice for scholars and researchers. And that's why the theme for today's webinar, talking about early career researchers, is great, because we get them while they're young and we get them used to using ORCID IDs, we get them used to best practice, we get them used to maintaining a public profile, thinking about how they're visible and how their data is used and shared. And that set of skills and that knowledge is going to help people throughout their whole career. That's a really valuable lesson to give people. So the outline of today's session is I'll pass over to Kristi Holmes in just a second, and she'll talk a little bit about the connections and relationships between VIVO and ORCID. Then we'll pass to John, who'll talk about ORCID IDs specifically and VIVO profiles. Simeon will talk about some of the challenges and some of the confusions that people face in integrating ORCID IDs, working with their VIVO profiles, understanding the difference between them. We'll go back to Kristi Holmes, who'll talk a little bit about the landscape in which ORCID operates, and then I'll just put all of the proceeding in a little bit of an international context. Then there'll be some time for questions and answers. So please make sure, if you think of a question as the webinar is progressing, to put it in the chat box. We will answer those at the end. So without further ado, I would like to pass over to Kristi. Kristi, if you're ready, over to you. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Josh. I appreciate that. So thank you, everyone, for having me today. It's a particular pleasure to speak about VIVO and ORCID in this venue, as both projects are near and dear to my heart. And I think that there are amazing opportunities that can be found as the two projects intersect in this scholarly ecosystem. So I think that probably everyone on the webinar today has heard about the concept of research networking and the process of making information readily and publicly available about the scholars and their efforts and activities at individual institutions. VIVO is one tool which enables this, and VIVO's approach really kicks this up a notch. VIVO enables information about scholars to be optimized using a web-based infrastructure of standards and technologies. This allows for a distributable, machine-readable description of data and smart web applications and linkages across many universities, agencies, societies, and so on, both within the United States as well as abroad. So for everyone who is not familiar with VIVO, I'd like to present a short introduction to the software, as well as to the many ways that we define VIVO. VIVO certainly is that open source semantic web application, and we'll take a look at the interface of the application here in a moment. But it's also an information model. So the VIVO ISF ontology allows the representation of research information in a standard way so that it can be interoperable, exchangeable, and really open up the possibilities of what we can do with data. And finally, and perhaps I think most important to me, is that VIVO is a wonderful open source community. You'll see here a screenshot from the DuraSpace wiki for the VIVO project, that there are a number of different bits of information about VIVO that can be found at the wiki. We invite you to take a look at the wiki or at vivoweb.org for more information about the project, to find resources, and to find ways of connecting. So as we see here on the right, there's a screenshot from Michael Conlin, who is the VIVO project director, which was recently announced. You can see that there's lots of information here about Mike's activities and roles at the University of Florida. As I mentioned, VIVO is an open source semantic web-based application. This enables it to be able to facilitate discovery of research information within an institution and across multiple institutions. VIVO is housed at the institution itself and harvests information from verified sources. So this allows the content in VIVO to be authoritative. It provides VIVO data as structured linked data about the investigators, their interests and activities, and this can help to facilitate science or other collaborative scholarly activities by enabling discovery. So allowing people to be able to find resources or individuals or opportunities, and also to be able to highlight those things for discovery as well. And again, just to highlight the open source community again, you can see the various places where you can connect with the VIVO project, and we encourage you to follow us on social networking as well. So there are a number of things that are happening at the local level where a research networking application, and particularly something as open as VIVO, can help to facilitate. So for instance, being able to highlight areas of expertise, connecting with colleagues, highlighting activities within specific geographic areas, creating biosketches and CVs and so on. So all of these things can be administratively can be a burden to individuals as well as organizations, and solutions like VIVO can help to facilitate that process. So I want to talk a little bit about how ORCID and VIVO complement one another. So as Josh mentioned, VIVO and ORCID have had a long and productive working relationship. The ORCID identifier has actually been part of the VIVO ontology for years, and I think that John will probably mention a little bit of this. The ORCID team did some wonderful work as part of the VIVO Collaborative Research Projects Program, which were awarded back in 2011. And this long history has perpetuated itself most recently to the Sloan projects, as well as to other projects happening at VIVO sites around the world as they integrate ORCID IDs locally within their VIVOs. And I know John will highlight a few of these. So when we think about VIVO and ORCID, how do these two concepts connect with one another? Well, we can think about the ORCID identifier as the permanent global identifier with enough information to aid in the disambiguation of a person. VIVO is typically an institutionally managed profile of that researcher's activities and outputs. And so we can understand that having open data exchange between these two entities can actually promote a number of activities at the institution level as well as on the individual level. So let's think about the career pathway of an investigator. Um, VIVO, as we start to think about VIVO and ORCID and their relationship with one another, VIVO stays at the institution, whereas ORCID stays with the researcher. So when we're thinking about these younger investigators, or junior investigators, there are a number of points in their career path where they may have changes in location, changes in name, and ORCID IDs allow for the connection between different profiles at the different institutions as the researcher moves, or as with some of the different name variants, as Josh discussed earlier. This connection is incredibly important because this will allow you to be able to follow individuals over time. And longitudinal tracking of people is a tough nut to crack. So we're not only looking at tracking individuals like our junior investigators, our students, scholars, and trainees, but we're also interested in keeping track of our distinguished alumni, visiting scientists, key administrators and their activities, because they are often very high profile, as well as trying to connect mentors and mentees. So this is a draft from the working group at Northwestern, and it's only a draft, but what I wanted to do is to highlight some of the ways that ORCID intersects with some of the local systems. So if you look up at the upper left-hand corner, we can see ORCID IDs could be minted by the PI or by the individual institution, or ORCID, and they flow in from ORCID.org via a service-oriented architecture. If you look at the upper right, we can see information vendors, and the ORCID ID is entered on published content workflows from the vendors. When we begin to look at the institutional content repositories, the ORCID is entered locally. And then finally, the green arrow at the bottom represents the opportunity for profile updates to be exchanged bidirectionally between ORCID.org and the institutional profiling systems. So again, let's think about this longitudinal tracking. ORCID plays an important role in this space. It allows us to be able to consider these individual local research information systems as the source of authoritative data, and then to tie them together through ORCID. Okay, so let's take a look at the longitudinal tracking, some specific examples. One institution has a behind the firewall VIVO to track their alumni for a period of 3 years after graduation, which is a requirement for their particular accreditation. As you might imagine, ORCID IDs would help reduce this effort and allow them to be able to track individuals. I'd also like to talk a little bit about the things that are happening at our own library. The library's recently launched a Metrics and Impact Core, which is focused on leveraging library resources and other sources of information at our institution and beyond for impact and justification for activities such as grant submissions and renewals, support for faculty research impact, and reporting outcomes to funding agencies. And we provide a number of services for that. This Metrics and Impact Core houses the evaluation and continuous improvement work of our Clinical and Translational Sciences Institute, or NUCATS, continuous evaluation and continuous improvement program. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Clinical and Translational Science Awards, it's a large funding opportunity from the National Institutes of Health. And the mission or the objective of this focused effort is to speed discoveries from the research bench into improved health of our communities in an effective and efficient manner. And a big part of that is aiding discovery. And so that's one way that research networking systems like VIVO really play an important role. But looking at the intersection of ORCID with VIVO, we can see that there are a number of activities around evaluation where we can really benefit from the intersection of ORCID and VIVO. So along the right-hand side, there are some sample common metrics that were identified a while ago by the CTSA consortium. And you can see the ones that I've placed a star beside, really, you can imagine will benefit from information that can be current and that can be updated as individuals move from institution to institution. I'd like to focus a little bit on the return on investment of these different scholar programs, the TL1, T32, and KL2 scholars. So those are individual training grants for junior investigators. But you can imagine that all of these would benefit from a single point to connect outputs, and that's what ORCID can help to provide. So other outputs such as activities around data curation, development of software tools, and so on. So what we're really interested in doing as part of evaluation and continuous improvement is seeking good data to be able to get a better perspective of the scholarly outputs for everyone that we're thinking about. And we all know what good data is. You know, we're looking at multiple sources, multiple subjects and disciplines, and we need it to be disambiguated and deduplicated. And ORCID can be a good way of pulling that information in. So we also want to be able to track this information moving forward so that we get a better perspective of scholarly outputs and also the influence of these wonderful training opportunities on the careers and success of our junior investigators. So ORCID obviously allows longitudinal tracking across diverse outputs. It can be a real complement to survey data. So we do have a qualitative REDCap data survey that we provide for our scholars. But often it can be difficult to make connections with people when they leave our institution. And the unique ORCID identifier that's been worked into our workflow for each of our scholars through NUCATS is really one way that we can stay connected. And then I'll just put in a plugin for also tracking our more distinguished alumni. So it's Alumni Weekend here at Feinberg School of Medicine. And we've also been thinking about people who left Northwestern a long time ago and trying to be able to collect a better idea of the things that they're doing. So ORCID can play a very valuable role across the career trajectory. So with that, I'll turn it over to John Corson-Rikert.
Hello, this is John, and I'm a developer at Cornell University. I've been working on VIVO for a number of years, and I'm going to be speaking about some of the more the mechanics of connections between ORCID and VIVO. So I'll describe briefly how ORCID is connected through the VIVO ISF ontology and also through the VIVO extensions to the VIVO software. And then I'll cover 4 quite different examples of how ORCID and VIVO are working together in practice at 4 different universities. So the ontology connection is really quite simple. There's a property, an ORCID ID property, which is actually an object property that supports linking VIVO persons and ORCID records in the linked data web. And the object of that property is a resource in the form of an ORCID ID in the URI form so that it actually operates as linked data. And then in the application, the software application, VIVO displays the ID as a direct link to the person's ORCID record. Cornell was a recipient of one of the 2014 ORCID Adoption and Integration Grants funded by the Sloan Foundation, and that enabled us to release VIVO 1.7 last summer in a manner that supports communication between VIVO and ORCID, and we've recently upgraded that for the changes to the ORCID API. And the basic idea is that you can create or confirm an ORCID ID directly with ORCID from VIVO. And there are actually dual outcomes anticipated. One is to so that the ORCID ID is added to the profile and is available to the institution and is confirmed as being the ORCID ID of the researcher who is actually logged into ORCID and the process of confirmation. So the university can be confident that they are indeed that ORCID person. And then in the other direction, VIVO requests permission of the researcher to provide their VIVO URI to ORCID. So in terms of how this looks in the application, on the Identity tab in VIVO, there's the ORCID ID is listed, and then there's a confirmation button there if sometimes the ORCID ID may come in from another system such as Symplectic, and it may be valuable to have the researcher just confirm that. And on the ORCID side, then that VIVO URI shows up as one of the external IDs that may be optionally included on an ORCID profile. So the examples, we have 4 different examples of how this has worked in practice. Cornell has quite a simple approach through VIVO. George Washington University is piloting some profile population from ORCID records. Texas A&M did a quite ambitious project of creating ORCID IDs for graduate students and adding them to VIVO, an internal-facing VIVO, and the University of Colorado has a very well-established program for creating ORCID IDs for faculty members that's becoming quite central to their fabric of researcher information. The Low Key approach at Cornell has been basically to offer the opportunity to create or confirm an ORCID ID through Cornell VIVO. This has been a little complicated by a separate faculty reporting path for part of the campus, where VIVO is not actually used for any data entry. To that extent, we're hoping to, as we move the whole campus to using symplectic elements for the reporting side behind the firewall, we can also leverage their ORCID integration. But in the meantime, we've set up a site called simply enough orcid.cornell.edu, and that site is available for anyone with a Cornell Net ID to log into and create or confirm an ORCID ID. So this is a way to promote ORCIDs for graduate students or for other people, staff members who conduct research who may not have a profile in VIVO. George Washington University is exploring this as part of a larger 5-university VIVO pilot organized by the Southeastern Universities Research Association, which is a group of 70 universities with the ambition of linking researchers across their 70 member institutions using VIVO. And Justin Littman at George Washington has pulled in publications and other information from ORCID as a proof of concept and an alternative to self-editing for researchers who aren't included in their faculty reporting systems. So that's seeming quite promising. And he has an example of 54 publications being brought in for one of their researchers. Texas A&M was another recipient of the 2014 grants. They minted over 10,000 ORCID IDs for graduate students and added them to an internal-facing VIVO. I think one of their motivations was to aid in the kinds of accreditation, confirmation, tracking that Kristi alluded to. It's important for accreditation. I believe there's a requirement to report on the research publications of former students for 3 years after they leave the university and receive their degree. So Violetta Illick was the researcher there who modeled the data using Karma, a tool from USC, and ingested it into VIVO. And they have developed an ORCID management app that supports minting of IDs and some email notifications related to that, managing existing IDs, and automating the publishing of the ORCID IDs. So, and they do the same kind of exchange of permission information that VIVO supports through VIVO itself. The University of Colorado-Boulder has probably the largest, most extensive program. They were a recipient of the grant between their Office of Faculty Affairs and the library, and they intend ORCID IDs to be used in a number of campus systems and to be shared with other university and affiliated systems. In April 2014, they did a pre-registration communication with their campus, focusing on the faculty. And then in July last year, they created over 3,000 new registrations focusing on tenure track instructors and research faculty, but not temporary faculty. It's interesting statistically that they received 3 opt-out requests, and they found that 210 faculty already had ORCID IDs. 22% of their faculty had claimed their ORCID ID within 3 days, which in July I think is quite impressive. And as of earlier this week, they've had just about 50% that have been claimed by researchers. They've had 12 deactivation requests, and they've increased the total number of IDs they've registered to over 3,300. Their ongoing implementation includes a new ORCID module in their internal reporting tool for the annual merit process or faculty, and it shows the status and helps them get information to claim or use their ORCID ID. And they've added a link from their VIVO page to ORCID, as has been done at Cornell. Here's an example of a professor's, the vice provost page, and that further down the page below the sort of highlighted areas of research areas and other activities, the ORCID ID is directly linked as a URI. Their ongoing implementation will include creating a view for department heads to see ORCID IDs for their faculty and whether it's been claimed. They've been sharing claimed ORCID IDs with their medical school to show up on Colorado Profiles, which is a medical research network out of their medical school based in Denver. And they've renewed their ORCID membership, which is, of course, very important for continuing the effort internationally. They have some more to-dos. They're going to be rerunning the registration process and estimate about 550 new ORCIDs being created this year. They're going to be leveraging the new functionality in symplectic elements. They're looking at new options for managing registration for new hires, and they're considering whether they will be pushing or ingesting data to and from ORCID. As sort of in a longer term perspective, there's a flagship 2030 effort at the University of Colorado, and they hope as part of that to develop a collaborative research enterprise among regional universities, businesses, government, and federal labs, of which there are a number in the Boulder area. And they see ORCID IDs shared across VIVO instances that are being already created at UNAVCO, a geodesy research network, at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and CU Boulder. They see these ORCID IDs in common as being a way to enable that vision. And just one final comment from Liz Tomich in the Office of Faculty Affairs. It has been quite a time commitment for a small technology team, roughly 3 to 4 months of a developer's time over the past year, or the past year and a half, but it has greatly expanded and accelerated the campus conversation related to scholarly work and research metrics. We now have a reproducible structure in place and more than 3,000 ORCID IDs to share with our data partners and vendors. So I believe it's a pretty impressive story.
Hi, I'm Simeon Warner, and I seem to have got the section with maybe not the greatest title, but I'll be pleased if I can help clarify a couple of issues. So the first one is perhaps the most frequent question around an ORCID record. How much information should my ORCID record have? Or perhaps in the context of this webinar, I have a VIVO profile already, so why should I maintain one in ORCID too? The bottom line is that with ORCID, it's a researcher choice. They're in control, and there's a question about, they can answer for themselves how much they want to put there. However, I'm going to argue that a certain amount of information and linking is very helpful. So say I want to create the minimal record. Registration really is very quick and easy. We say 30 seconds, and that's probably not far off the truth. You have to enter a name, an email address, a password, and agree to the privacy policy and conditions. Now, a minimal record is already useful in that you get an ID, and that's a permanent ID you can use, and you can put it into workflows. So if you're submitting a journal article or something, you can already use that ID. However, the web view is really not very useful. Which John Smith is this? As I said, it's already useful to use this ID, but for someone who finds that ID and resolves that, they don't get very much information. Now, if this ID is used in workflows, then potentially works will be added later as they're published through integrations with publishers. But let's say John has a VIVO profile. We've just created a confusion of IDs here because there's a VIVO profile with one ID for John and an ORCID profile with a second. These two should clearly be connected. So let's think about what a helpful ORCID record might be. I think there are sort of two aspects to this. The first is provide enough information so that someone who follows a link to the record, however they found it, or searches for you, can understand which John Smith you are. So you might want to put in any alternate names you go by, something about where you're at, perhaps a few works. Now, it doesn't have to be a complete set of your works, but most people like to highlight a few of their popular things. This already means that someone who stumbles upon your identity can work out whether that is the right one or whether you're the person they were expecting, potentially how to contact you if you wanted to add that. The second aspect is really link this ORCID record to other identifiers, perhaps places where you do maintain a more detailed set of information. So in the case that I have a VIVO profile at Cornell that is perhaps more complete than my ORCID profile, I would definitely want to link through the sort of integration John was talking about to my VIVO profile. I might also choose to link a Scopus author ID, a researcher ID, an ISNI, and there are wizards to help you do all of these things. So here's a slightly more useful profile. This might not be complete, but I'd argue that this is the sort of level of a profile that's helpful and perhaps doesn't have a burden of maintenance of the complete record, which I perhaps maintain on VIVO. So I have other IDs on the left there. Here, this record has a researcher ID and a Scopus author ID, some education information and employment information. This record doesn't happen to have any publications listed. Now, of course, it's someone's choice whether they want to make it a really expansive ORCID record that tries to describe everything they do. And there are a number of import wizards from services like Scopus, Researcher ID, from individual VIVOs that can bring all the information together. And a key feature of the ORCID UI is that if you're bringing information about works from multiple sources, there will end up being slightly different descriptions of the same work, and the UI groups this information together to present one work and allows the user to select which is their preferred view of it to present it in the way they want. So to sum up this idea of how much information should my ORCID record have, it should have the amount, the picture I choose. It really isn't necessary for an ORCID record to present a complete picture, but you can obviously link out to other systems such as VIVO that do provide that, and that's then an efficient way to maintain information. So switching topics a second, VIVO is grounded in the semantic web, and ORCID is not as fundamentally semantic web as VIVO, but the ORCID ID is a URI, so it works in that way as an object, as John described. There's limited support for RDF output, and more work is on the roadmap. We recently saw a wonderful little report published by the W3C to suggest some clarifications on the subtle technical distinctions of the ORCID ID for the person and the URI used for the page. And we're extremely pleased to have Ivan Herman on the ORCID Technical Steering Group, who's from the W3C. So I think watch this space for some changes there. So then, ORCID is one of many person identifiers. We have an acronym soup of possible person identifiers. And perhaps the bottom line here is that there is, in the near future, going to be no single person identifier for all uses. However, let's go back to think about what ORCID is. What does the O stand for? O stands for open, and it's open in the sense of open standards, open membership, and open for use and reuse. ORCIDs are remarkably unencumbered in that sense and therefore play very well in interoperability. The R and the C of ORCID stand for researcher and contributor. ORCID has academic focus, but we note that it's contributor, not author. The scope is beyond just the authors, but everyone involved in the academic process. Whoops. Oh, sorry. So there are differences of scope here. ORCID, for example, is not designed to provide identifiers for people publishing CDs with my favorite piece of punk music, but it is designed for everyone in academia. ISNI, for example, is focused more around rights management. So there are clearly large overlaps here, but there are definitely use cases for both. So I'd like to highlight two things about ORCIDs. One is that ORCID requires a small amount of activity from the researcher. So ORCID is only for people who are living. It's not for the back catalogue of works catalogued by libraries, which, for example, VIAF is doing work to pull those identifiers together. And the second is that ORCID IDs and their APIs are designed to be used in workflows. So the phrase I've come up with and like is an ounce of ambiguity avoidance is worth a pound of disambiguation. The idea of using ORCID IDs in workflows avoids name ambiguity at the very source when we have the researcher engaged. And then finally, while ORCID is being used in these workflows, this hub function that I think Josh mentioned first is very, very important. So the idea that here's my ORCID profile, and on it I have an ISNI that was assigned to me, my VIVO Cornell ID, and some other IDs. That's really key. And I think facilities such as the one described that link ORCID IDs conveniently and effectively into VIVO systems are critical.
Okay, thank you, Simeon. So that certainly, I think, is a good foundation for a few of the topics that I want to cover in this next short section. So I think that we all are aware that there is an unbelievable amount of work being done in this space of unique identifiers. And I think the real interesting work happens as we try and pull together this information across all of these disparate sources. So I think what I want to do is just provide some food for thought and some areas of possible work and contemplation. And certainly this topic is of great interest to many of us on the webinar, and certainly all of us in the VIVO community, and would encourage you to consider even submitting a paper or poster for the upcoming VIVO conference in August in Cambridge. So the increasing number of these unique identifiers can be really challenging. And one thing that we're considering, or that we've been talking about, is that perhaps ORCID provides crosswalking services and can function as a global same as registry. So that is, when you consider all of the diverse sites that are providing information about the same real world entity, there needs to be a single point that can help to enable that crosswalking across the different sites. And as Simeon pointed out in his comments, ORCID already allows researchers to be able to supplement their records with additional external resource identifiers. And I think that this is a key use case for ORCID. I've just taken a screenshot from mine and have linked to a few of my IDs as well as other websites. So, I think that this really does provide an opportunity for ORCID as well as connecting it with the VIVOs. Certainly, the temporal aspects of this space are important as we begin to think about the movement of investigators or the change in their career path and the influence that that has with the information that's stored within different data sources. And then I think it's important to also recognize that there are specific goals of linking these different data sources. and consider how these can be achieved in concert with other groups that are dedicated and working in this space, particularly the library community, a number of efforts around disciplinary repositories, and so on. So this is a hot area, lots of interesting work happening, and I am optimistic and excited about the activities that will be happening in the months and years ahead in this space. So I'd like to turn it over to Josh for and hope that he can place all of this into the international context. Josh.
Thanks, Kristi. Thank you. And thanks everyone for a great series of presentations there. So we've obviously, with the panel of presenters we have today, we've had a fairly North American focus. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work that's being done elsewhere that I think is of relevance here, and just gives you a sense of some of the other things that might be in the pipeline or are kind of evolving as we speak now. It's just a very brief kind of overview of a few interesting developments and some ideas that are coming up. So ORCID and VIVO have been working together for a while now. We've been working in partnership with other international organizations. And one of those things we do is we work with other standards bodies to help to make sure that the applications of standards are consistent, that they are ubiquitous, and that we're working with things in the real world. Simeon mentioned our engagement with W3C. Now that's very important to us. It really helps us to make sure that in the world of linked data, in the world of in the world of web-based scholarly communications, we're actually really working to the very highest standards. Another of our recent collaborations is with CASRE, the Consortia Advancing Standards in Research Administration Information. Now they're a really great body who do data dictionaries as the core of their standard, to ensure that when an Englishman talks about a lift, an American knows that he's talking about an elevator, and that you're essentially talking about a vertical mechanism for moving goods and people within a building. So that's a great project, but we'd be working with them and the Wellcome Trust and others on Project Credit, which is about unpicking the different types of contribution people can make to the research process. Now, if you think about if you contribute to the creation of a data set, if you review a project application or an article before publication, these don't necessarily end up in your ORCID record or your VIVO profile. And if they appear in multiple data sources, they might be defined differently. So you can see all sorts of ways right away, I think, that the 14 roles that were pulled out via Project Credit were turned into a taxonomy
Sure. Thanks, Josh. That's a great question. So, I think ultimately, when you think about impact and tracking, I mean, we're very interested at the institution level in knowing what kind of training programs and interventions, if you will, help to facilitate successful research careers. But from the individual level, I think it's really important for those young scholars to consider how they best or how they can put their best foot forward. So a huge amount of the impact of one's scholarship is directly tied to the dissemination of that scholarship. And so by engaging with ORCID and making sure that you are curating that ORCID page to the utmost of your ability, listing your institutions, keeping everything together, I think that's really important. Also, having your scholarly activities available in VIVO, which presents open machine-readable data that comes back with high hits on the search engines, and making sure and keeping that profile as curated as possible. All of that works together to really elevate your presence to the next level.
So I think I would add
That's
to that
that's a
I'd
great answer,
emphasize.
Kristi. That's really persuasive. Go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry. I'd emphasize Kristi's point that, the need for good publicity and doing that through your local Vivo is very important for young researchers. But one of the features of young researchers is that they really do move as well. A typical, physicist is going to do a PhD, is going to then do probably 2 postdocs, each lasting 1, 2, or 3 years, and then hopefully get a faculty position. So that's 4 institutions probably before they're up for tenure. So connecting these things together is very, very important, and that's, I think, where ORCID comes in.
Actually, that brings me to a question that I wanted to ask John as well, actually, which is very related to that, which is about this idea of sharing the Vivo URI via your ORCID record. Do you think that there's a function there that services that could be built linking using the profile possibly with future and past Vivo profiles? As Simeon says, you could have 4 profiles attached to your name in a very short space of time at the beginning of your career.
Hey, John, sorry to interrupt. If you are speaking, we cannot hear you. Okay, apologies for that. It looks like we lost John. Are you there? Yeah.
Sure. So, okay, relationship and roles between SciVal experts and Vivo at Northwestern. So, yeah, that's a great question. So, I think that probably everyone on the call knows that institutions often have multiple solutions in this space. And I think that they all fill different needs. We have had a long-standing Northwestern Scholars instance, which is the Elsevier SciVal Experts platform, and it's being we're upgrading to Pure. I will say for us, or for the way that we're thinking about it, there are challenges because it's not a complete snapshot of activity that's happening on campus. Some of our clinical faculty aren't in it. Certainly, we have a number of junior investigators, scholars, postdocs, and so on. So, I can see at our institution as well as at others that that different platforms fulfill those needs. We have several. I think there's also an exciting there's an exciting space when you think about certainly something like SciVal Experts presents, a really polished, beautiful snapshot of the activities or outputs that are within that system. But when you're looking at trying to accomplish that activity as well as highlight a more dynamic picture of research, so looking at core research facilities, data sets, the integration of these things across institutional resources and so on, that's maybe one space where then a Vivo can step in and do something like that. And I'll also step in with one additional comment. Oh, sorry, I was going to offer to, if anyone would be interested in additional information, I'd be happy to connect you with the folks doing those projects.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kristi.
So I think my audio is back. This is John. So I probably lost some connection to. So what question am I answering now? Yes, absolutely. This is very important for the Vivo community, and we're also hearing from the library community that they want to start including Vivo URIs in library catalog records, and in order to do that, they want assurances that the Vivo URIs will be stable. So normally one thinks of a Vivo as being kind of a current awareness service of people who are at the institution now, but we're looking into ways to maintain VIVO URIs over the longer term so that someone who has moved could still have information from that time period available. And that, I think the crosswalking capability of ORCID in this regard is going to be very important. Only that I believe Justin is hoping that he can share that work as soon as it's mature enough, so the rest of the VIVO community could adopt it if they want to. It's behind the firewall now, and I think it's still being evaluated for what the workflow role will be at George Washington.
I think my piece of advice would be think of them together. They're two important pieces of the infrastructure that play nicely and work better if one imagines them as part of the larger ecosystem.
So I would chip in with a comment that the most challenging part of technology projects are often the conversations that need to happen. So I would encourage people to sit down with stakeholders and understand their needs and motivations so that a more comprehensive, thought out solution with lots of support can happen at the beginning.
And this is John. I jump in and say that we've had very positive response at Cornell in mentioning ORCID as we reach out to our colleges here and encourage them to provide data to VIVO. They understand the need for ORCID because they've had to work with the challenges of disambiguation. So I think working together makes a lot of sense.
Right. Thank you very much, Josh, and a huge thank you to John, Kristi, and Simeon. As Josh already mentioned, you provided us with a lot of great information. This has been a very popular series. As Josh mentioned in the beginning, the series is being recorded and will be made available to you at DuraSpace duraSpace.org/hot topics later this week. So thank you all very much. This concludes today's session. Enjoy the rest of your day.